Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye in an auditorium of audacity. I'm your holier-than-thou host, DJ BJ Turnov, representing the mind's eye on Stitcher Radio and Z Talk Radio. We have a very merry mind's eye special for you all tonight, particularly for all my Christians and non-Christians gathering on Christmas to celebrate Jesus. It's interesting to think that there are so many people out there that also believe that he didn't even exist at all. Truth be told, by today's scientific standards, we're never going to be able to fully prove if he lived. But what if we can prove some of the biblical events and locations connected to the man were real and around at the time of Jesus? Let's start at the end of his life at the Cenacle on Mount Zion, where Jesus is said to have had the Last Supper there. His brother James is believed to have been interred at the spot, and the biblical King David, ancestor of Jesus, supposedly is buried beneath its floor. Christian scholar Christian Clausen joins us to talk about his first-of-a-kind study into the sacred structure, which is also featured in his new book, The Upper Room and Tomb of David, The History, Art, and Archaeology of the Cenacle on Mount Zion. David is going to share his research into the holy spot and share if it really dates back to the time of Christ. Was the Last Supper really celebrated there? And did King David's remains ever lie there? We uncover these millennia-old mysteries when the Mind's Eye returns. You're listening to The Mind's Eye on Z-Talk Radio and Stitcher Radio. Before we get into the archaeological evidence behind some of the mysteries on Mount Zion, let me give you the skinny on why 2019 was such a banner year for excavations in the Middle East. Researchers were able to decipher secret codes in Christian text, uncover old mosaics and altars, and also found ancient churches and villages with biblical ties. Read about some of these amazing discoveries now on our website at themindseyemedia.com, or just go straight to Facebook and Twitter at Mind's Eye Show. At any of these spots, you'll be able to find out more information about tonight's guest, Christian Clausen. When we come back, he'll talk about some of the archaeological digs around the supposed location of the Last Supper, find out about these discoveries and if any were of Jesus' time in a Mind's Eye moment. Christian Clausen, adjunct lecturer in Christian origins at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, joins us for a very special Mind's Eye holiday edition. Happy holidays, David.
Thank you, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing well. How's everything on your side?
Very good. We just broke from the semester, so I've got a few weeks off.
You must be absolutely thrilled. I imagine you're going to probably relax for a little bit, unless you're doing something particularly special for the holiday.
Yeah, you would think so, but I'm really just going to jump right back into preparing for spring. It's like it never ends.
Yeah, once 2019 is done, you're already thinking about 2020.
You got it.
I think it's safe to say Merry Christmas to you. I'm assuming you celebrate Christmas.
Sure, absolutely. Merry Christmas to you as well.
I appreciate that, and I'd like to cover our bases. Happy holidays. I am Jewish, so I guess I celebrate Hanukkah, but I guess I put the more, I'm sure you've heard this, Jew-ish. I'm more of the ish than the Jew, I would say.
I know many Jewish friends who have Christmas trees, so it all works.
In fact, I hate to say this, I've probably celebrated Christmas more over the past decade than I have Hanukkah. I hate to admit that. But let's start there since it is Christmas Eve. And I guess what isn't safe to say is I guess there's a huge debate whether Jesus was actually born on December 25th tomorrow. You have a recent blog entry on your website that actually addresses this. Share your thoughts on the matter.
Yeah, I did some research on it. I'm offering a course next spring on medieval Christianity, and one of the questions that does come up is about the establishment of the holidays, which really didn't start until after Constantine made Christianity legal again and also the favored religion. So it was at that time that holidays such as Easter and Christmas began to be sort of openly celebrated, and there was a debate. The Eastern Church opted for January 6th as its day, and the Western Church generally went with December 25th. So there was a bit of a minor controversy between the two sides, but ultimately the 25th won out, and January 6th remained as the day of Epiphany. But the 25th is really more based on the calculation of Mary's date of conception than on any particular evidence about the birth date of Jesus.
And if you had to weigh in on each side, what do you think, January 6th or December 25th?
I tell my students that any day is possible, just as equally likely as any other. There's really no way to know. I mean, this is all pretty speculative when you get down to it.
I guess staying with that notion, since you do teach Christian origins, and are you religious? Would you say?
I'm more of an academic Christian, if you want to use some kind of a term. I have obviously a Christian cultural upbringing, but I do these days approach Christianity from more of a historical perspective.
So, do you take everything from the Bible as gospel?
No, that would be what I would call the fundamentalist approach, and I take more of a historical approach. What I tell my students is that we treat the Bible in our class. It's an academic, secular institution, of course, so we treat the text as ancient text, and as historians, we're free to question. We're free to look and accept inconsistencies and implausibilities and explore them for the information that they provide. So no, I would not call myself a fundamentalist, which is the word I would use.
The idea that Jesus may or may not have existed, and I mean, to me, Jesus seems like he had such a huge impact that it would seem almost impossible for him to be fake. And academically speaking, and there seems to be numerous non-Christian sources that do talk about him. I mean, where did the Jesus didn't exist theory originate?
Well, this is the problem with history, and I tell my students that history is not about proving things. What we have is evidence that's left to us from the past, be it literary or archaeological, and we make the best interpretation of that evidence that we can. And so we deal in probabilities, lesser or greater probabilities. And I would agree with you, Brian, that the greater probabilities of the evidence we have says that, of course, Jesus existed. There's simply too much there to ignore. But if you want to challenge, if you want to be on the other end of that debate, there's nothing in history you can't challenge. There's nothing that you can suggest never happened, that it was made up. So those who have that agenda can certainly pull together some discrepancies or things and challenge Christian historicity. But as far as Jesus goes, I don't think there's a mainstream scholar around that would doubt his existence.
Yeah, I think history can sometimes be like math, and stats and data. It can be easily manipulated into, whatever opinion you have.
Yes, that's exactly right. We have such, for a person, Jesus is generally thought to have been of the lower peasant class where he came from in Nazareth. We have extraordinary amount of information about him, just beginning with Paul, only a couple of decades after Jesus' death. He's in touch with the people who knew him, and we have his letters. So, I think it's kind of spurious to argue that there was no Jesus.
And your book takes a look at the events that surrounded Jesus and his death, and whether there's veracity and validity to it. Your book, the Upper Room and Tomb of David, the history, art, and archaeology of the Cenacle on Mount Zion, goes into this. So for the uninitiated, what is the Cenacle?
Cenacle is a strange word. It's the anglicized version of coenaculum, which is Latin. It comes from Jerome's Latin translation of the Greek scriptures, what we know as the Vulgate. And he used that word to translate two Greek terms that both mean upper room. So what we're talking about here is the upper room that features in the Gospels as well as the Acts of the Apostles.
So just give us I alluded to it before, but I'm sure you can sum it up a little bit better than I can, definitely more eloquently for sure. Just give us the premise of the book.
Yeah, what I do is one thing that has never been done before, and that is to try to assemble all the extant evidence going back as far as we can, and also including modern archaeological reports, and try to tie together everything that we know about this building that currently exists in Jerusalem that is called the Cenacle. It's reputed to be the upper room. What do we know about it? How far back does our knowledge go? So I've attempted to assemble all of that in one convenient place. And then, of course, along the way, I've made a couple of arguments of my own.
And why the Cenacle is so important that you're looking at it is that supposedly a slew of biblical events happened there. Just name some of the big ones so we can just kind of so we can give how important it is and why you're investigating.
Exactly. Well, the first and probably the most important for people would be the Last Supper. This upper room is where Jesus supposedly had his disciples prepare the Passover meal. This is according to the Gospel of Mark. Then we have in the Gospel of Luke more reference to the upper room as the place where Jesus appeared to his disciples after his resurrection. And then again, Luke talks about the upper room in Acts as being the place where the Pentecost event took place. So those are really three big events in the life of Jesus and the early church.
Who actually owns the Cenacle right now?
Yeah, ownership is a dicey question, but right now it's controlled by the Israeli Antiquities Authority. So as far as at least pseudo-ownership, they have complete control of what takes place there. You can argue ownership going back in history to the previous owners, the Muslims, to the Franciscans, to just about anybody in history has laid claim, as you say, to this place. And obviously it's on early Jerusalem territory, so Jewish concerns come up as well. So historically, I don't know who owns it, but currently the Israeli Antiquities Authority manages it and controls it.
Were there any other huge events that occurred there outside of, I guess, New Testament related?
Well, the ground floor is known to Jews and Muslims and Christians as well as the so-called Tomb of David. That's King David, of course, from the Bible. That has been revered since at least Crusader times as the spot where David was buried. And there currently is an empty sarcophagus in the bottom floor. You can go in there and take a look at it. It is a Jewish synagogue and yeshiva on the first floor, but you may go in and look at the sarcophagus, which supposedly marks the spot where David was buried.
And describe some of the other features of the Cenacle. What does it look like physically inside and out right now?
Yeah, if you went there now, you would find kind of snuggled in amongst many buildings of mostly Ottoman era structure, Ottoman era provenance. This little two-story building, it is mostly covered up. The two exterior walls that are exposed would be the eastern wall, which is fully exposed on the outside, and the southern wall, which is partially exposed, but the north and west are completely covered. You can't, so it's very difficult even to find. You have to follow the sign. So look for Cenaculum, because that's the sign that you'll see when you go. When you enter the first floor, of course, is the Tomb of David, and that would be open to visitors. You can go in there. And the second floor would be to any, I guess, historian or expert in architecture, you would know immediately that the room does not date from the time of Jesus. It's very Gothic in its architecture. You see arches and architectural features more reflective of Gothic style than anything in the first century. So you have to remember that however old this original building was, it's been restored and renovated many, many times over the last 2,000 years. But in the second floor, it's basically empty. There's nothing in there. A few columns support the roof structure. Many tourists go in there, Christians primarily, and they sing hymns and revere it as at least the nominal site of the upper room. And then on the top, if you can get a bird's eye view, there are many photographs. If you can't find a way to see it, you can see remains of Islamic period. There is a dome on top and a minaret, and even within the upper room itself, there are Muslim features that have remained ever since. So it's quite an eclectic mixture of religious structures and features.
I'm a bit surprised. So it is open to the public?
It is indeed, yes. Visiting hours all day. You have to be reverent, especially on the first floor, because there are many Jews who are praying and so forth in the bottom. The upper floor, not so much prayer, but a lot of hymn singing and reverence for the site. So even though it is holy, it's wide open for the public.
It just seems so, too good to be true in a sense. When normally something is too good to be true, then normally it is. And I don't mean to, question the validity or anybody's religious beliefs there. But, if Jesus really did have his Last Supper there. I can't imagine they'd let it open to the public. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a recognition there that even though perhaps the geography might be correct, that's an argument you could make. It's pretty clear that most of the structure is post dates the time of Jesus.
And we're going to go into all of the archaeological excavations and what was found there. But how did you get? What were the seeds for this book from your side? What started you to write this book? Was it a visit to that area when you were in Israel?
It was. I was working on my master's degree at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and we have the university sponsors a dig on Mount Zion, has done so for about the last 10 years. We're still involved in it. And so I went to participate in that dig. The dig currently is focused on an estate, a mansion that belonged to a chief priest of the first century. So that's exciting. But nearby was of course the upper room. And one of the requirements that I had for my master's degree was to write a paper on a significant building in Jerusalem that had an impact on Christian origins. And of course, that was my area of study. So my professor, Dr. James Tabor, he took me up to the Cenacle for the first time, and I was fascinated, and so was he. He had been a friend of Bargil Pixner, who's someone that you've read about in my book, and he was a Dominican priest who did a lot of archaeology work around the area. And so I just became totally fascinated by the structure, and that led me to write a paper, which then turned out to be my thesis, and that turned out to be the book. So that's how that happened.
The Cenacle is located on Mount Zion. Mount Zion is considered to be one of the holiest places, but depending on who you talk to, there are 3 different Mount Zions. Why the discrepancy there?
That's right. If anyone who looks up Mount Zion in the Bible, the original reference was to the city of David. We can find that in 2 Samuel 5:7, for example. And the biblical city of David was the Ophel, the original Jebusite city that David conquered, according to tradition and history. And that was Mount Zion, just a little strip, what today is the eastern part of the city of Jerusalem. Then Solomon, who built the first temple and his palace on a little hill just to the north, a hill we also refer to as Mount Moriah, that became incorporated into the city of David and into the idea of Mount Zion. We think it was around the time of Herod the Great who established his palace on the western hill, a hill to the west of the city of David that was largely uninhabited, and he chose that hill to build a spectacular palace, one that really needs to be archaeologically excavated. But once he moved over there, the royal retinue came with him, the chief priests, the people with money, built their large estates all around the palace, and for some reason that became known as Mount Zion. It was the upper city of Jerusalem. The lower city, which was the original Mount Zion, became a home to tradesmen and people of the lower classes. So perhaps in time it became hard to understand that sort of lower class part of the city as being the home to the greatest king, of Israel's history. So it seems that at that time Mount Zion became the western hill, and that today is what's referred to as Mount Zion.
And you do a great job of parsing through that and being able to show this happened on this part of the hill, this happened on this part of the hill, and that was a really fascinating part, and locating what are the events, what can we prove happened where and happened there, and that's really the part of the main part of the book is finding the true age of the Cenacle, which then either support or deny the notion that some of these events could have happened there or in that area. And to me, it's kind of, from the outside looking in, it seems like it could be an easy solve if we just apply some contemporary archaeological strategies. Why hasn't this been solved yet, finding the true age?
Well, that's a great question. Part of the problem is that we are very restrictive in what we can do archaeologically. You can imagine the contentiousness that might obtain if we went in and started digging up the ground. For one thing, there's a Muslim cemetery just outside the east wall. That presents problems. All the faiths lay claim to the site. They probably would not necessarily agree on what could be dug up and what couldn't. Also, it's a terrific tourist spot. So the only small probes that have been allowed have had to have been done after hours, with everything patched back up before the before the opening of the Cenacle the next day, or the Tomb of David. So the IAA is not real anxious to disrupt the tourist flow, and the political and religious reality make exploration very difficult. So we're limited to sort of things we can do on the surface, explorations of literature, and this type of thing. Though, as you suggest, a dedicated archaeological exploration would answer many questions.
Let's talk about some of the archaeological evidence that we do have.
Mm-hmm.
So start with the most recent. I think in the book it said it was 2012 was the most recent dig around that area.
Right. Amit Re'em, who is a archaeologist with the IAA, he was, I mentioned some selective probings, and he was able to do that over there, and he dug in the floor of the bottom level, that would be the Tomb of David area, just some what we call probe pits. They're just very small, very limited digs, maybe no more than a foot by a foot, just to dig down and see, what can be found. He was following the work of a 1951 archaeologist by the name of Jacob Pinkerfeld, who wrote really the only archaeological semi-report to come out in modern times, and it was the claim was that this was a early Jewish synagogue. So Re'em went in to try to recover some of the evidence, or repeat the dig, refine the evidence that Pinkerfeld had come up with, and he couldn't. The places he was forced to dig did not support what Pinkerfeld had discovered in terms of the original level of the floor, the presence of a mosaic on the floor, some different things of that sort. And also Re'em says that he found a coin of the Byzantine era, a 4th century coin, in the mortar between the stones below the surface, or the stones below the visible surface. So that was part of the evidence he brought to bear to date the entire structure from the bottom, or the earliest date of the structure, to the time of the 4th century, the early Byzantine years. So the debate has been, beginning with Pinkerfeld, is this an early 1st or 2nd century building, or, as Re'em suggests, is this a 4th century Byzantine building? Obviously, it makes a huge difference to Christians who want to make of this at least some part of the structure as dating back to the time of Jesus.
Because if you could do that, then that would pretty much prove or come close to proving some of in their eyes, these biblical events happened then.
Well, it would certainly tell us that this building existed then, and then you would have to, the onus, I think, would be on those who wanted to disprove it. If the building existed, there's no reason for Christians to pick this area to celebrate these events in the life of Jesus. You could pick anywhere. Why pick this place? And what's interesting is that there's no other place in Jerusalem that has ever laid claim to being the place of the Last Supper or the Pentecost event or anything else. It's always been here.
But physically speaking, the coin that's how we date it, is the 4th century. We have nothing else physically that predates that.
Well, yeah, that's basically true. But the problem with the coin is that it was found in mortar between the stones. And again, and I wish that this report had been published more broadly so that we could ask more questions and so forth. But the problem with that is that the stones that are visible, the lowest level of stones, which obviously would be the lowest strata and the oldest stones, we call them ashlars, they are not joined by mortar. So what is the difference here? This was the publication of this report is not widely disseminated. It's very difficult to get a handle on. I think it's open to some questions, but I'm not challenging Re'em's integrity. I'm just saying that under the circumstances, it would be nice if that we could open up this place and let other scholars get into the dig and look and check along with the results and so forth. So I think that his probe asked more questions than it answered.
And what about anecdotally speaking? What's the earliest known account that says this is the area where all these events happened?
Well, it's regrettably Byzantine. It's 4th century. After Constantine, became the emperor, there was a heightened interest in pilgrimage and the Holy Land and the places where, Jesus walked. And all of a sudden now that Christianity was legalized and favored, there was a big interest in the places where Jesus was and where the events in his life took place. So it's the 4th century. It's Eusebius, the father of church history, we call him, because he wrote in the 4th century a history of the Christian church. And Epiphanius, who is a later 4th century theologian who wrote a book against a number of heresies. Both of these are our earliest literary sources for telling us that there is a church on Mount Zion that goes back to the apostles where these events took place.
Let's just put a pin in the conversation right now just for a moment so we can get a word from our sponsors. When we come back, we're going to talk about the other part of the book, the Tomb of David and the history behind that. We'll be right back with David Christian Clausen in a Mind's Eye moment. The Mind's Eye Holiday Special continues now with David Christian Clausen. We're talking about his book, The Upper Room and Tomb of David, the history, art, and archaeology of the Cenacle on Mount Zion. Let's talk a little bit about the Tomb of David. When did the Cenacle start? When did that get connected to the Tomb of David?
Well, our earliest evidence goes back to the Crusades. Ramon de Gallier wrote that when he first entered Jerusalem after the siege, he discovered a tomb, a monument to King David there at Mount Zion. He was with the group that approached the city from the south, from Mount Zion. So that's really our earliest connection between the two.
And most scholars seem to say that David was buried in the city of David, which is on the other Mount Zion, Eastern Hill, I guess, of ancient Jerusalem. What are your thoughts there? I mean, is that true? What do you think?
Well, it's biblical, right? Because we can read in 1 Kings 2:10 that David was buried there, and there's an archaeologist in the early, I think it was 1913, Raymond Wheel, who believed that he had found the actual tomb of David, and there's obviously some dispute there, but yeah, I don't think there's much historicity that David was buried on Zion, because in those days Mount Zion was, as far as we know, just unpopulated. It doesn't seem like it would be the place, at least for his original burial. Now, nothing, I guess, suggests that he couldn't have been moved, but we don't have any evidence that took place. I heard an interesting suggestion by another scholar that perhaps the sons of King David, the descendants, the later kings, maybe some of them might be buried on Mount Zion, but again, that's just speculation.
Because there are bones that have been found in various parts of Mount Zion, and lots of them, right?
Yeah, that is true. And in fact, if we can get into this now, there's a cavern beneath the Tomb of David, which was discovered to have many bones inside.
Talk about that.
Yeah, this was first discovered by Ermete Pierotti, who was the architect consultant for the Ottoman governor of Jerusalem. And he, just as a kind of an amateur archaeologist, he went digging around this area, and on the western side of Mount Zion, he found an opening, a cave that looked like it may have had a door at one time, that it may have had hinges. And he dug around in there, and he got in a little ways. He describes it, and you can read the description in the book, but he there's a lot of rubbish in there, a lot of trash, but he forces himself in as far as he can go. He's got a torch, and he sees that this cavern extends all the way to what he suggests is the area of the Tomb of David, and there are untold numbers of skeletons inside. He also describes columns supporting a roof structure in there, but he said it was so packed with debris that he couldn't progress very far. Now that's a great story, except that we'll go back to Reveaklng, who did some probes, as we discussed, around the Tomb of David. He did ground-penetrating radar analysis of the area, and he confirms that beneath the area of the Tomb of David is a depression, a cavern, about 5 feet below. He says that I don't understand ground-penetrating radar, but from his results, he says that it's quite cavernous and that there's an air pocket at the top. And Dr. Shimon Gibson, who's a friend of mine and the co-director of our dig on Mount Zion, he has rediscovered the opening that Pierotti found on the west side of Mount Zion. So we have, in my mind, confirmed that there is a cavernous burial crypt. Charnel house is the word that they used to use, of bones of undetermined origin and date. So it would be obviously very fascinating to get under there and see just what we're dealing with.
Yeah, do we actually know that for a fact, that there are bones underneath there? Since they rediscovered it, have they gone inside of it and seen those bones?
No, that's a good point. We only have Pierotti's word for it at this point. And I should bring up, and maybe because you've been over there, that any time you dig up the remains of the dead in Israel, you are compelled to get those remains reburied immediately. And there is, unless you can figure out a way around the system, there is no way to do the kind of forensic research on those fragments, those remains that we would like to do. And it's very frustrating. This happens a number of times when ossuaries, bone boxes are found. If some of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish groups find out, they are all over the dig and they demand that the remains be taken away. So you don't get the opportunity to do the kind of forensic research that we would like to do. So it's a very dicey situation to go under there, knowing or at least suspecting that you're going to be pulling out a lot of human remains.
Can't we go in there and not really be evasive like that?
I don't know. I guess it all depends on what we would find. We would have to crawl under there again and kind of do a survey. But I think once we announced that we discovered human remains, then I don't know. To be quite honest, I don't know what the ramifications would be if we don't disturb them, if that's even possible. Could we just leave them in situ? I don't know the answer, Brian. It's a great question.
And that's, to me, is like so frustrating because we have all these legends and they seem to be founded in some truth for sure. And we're so close to maybe being able to prove that we almost have it in the clutches of our hand and we can't do anything about it. I mean, to me, that's just so frustrating.
It is. We just have to be very, very, very careful and plan things out. And even then, I'm not sure what we could do.
Yeah, we have this legend of a cave. We find possible evidence of a cave. All this archaeological evidence that points to, definitely 4th century, maybe even more. And there's nothing that we can do about it. It's definitely
not at the moment.
Taking a look at that, and since you've done a dig in Israel, and you probably have more connections to that, does it look like there's any possible chance that some future excavations could be happening there, or is there going to be any opening up to really doing more biblical archaeology there?
Well, Dr. Gibson and I are doing some work now. We're actually at the moment trying to bring to light a excavation that was done a number of years ago by Emanuel Eisenberg, and which never got published, which helps us to locate the, there were 2 churches successively built on or near the Cenacle. There was first the Byzantine church Hagia Sion, which was built to commemorate a number of things. This was built in the late 4th century. I believe personally it was built adjacent to the Cenacle. Others suggest that what the Cenacle is today is merely the remains of that church. And then there was a Crusader church built adjacent to the destroyed remains of the Byzantine church. So what we hope to bring to light is some really specific locational data of just exactly how the churches lay and coordinate the Cenacle in that mapping. So we're going to bring about the first, I think, very detailed map of Mount Zion in this area to ever come out. So we're working on that. Your question was, what about future digs around the Cenacle? Here's the problem. I mean, there are many problems other than the ones I mentioned. It takes money. That's a big problem. And it takes competent dig directors who want to do the work, and they're not in, great supply. Competent archaeologists who have the time and resources to take over a project like that. And then, of course, there's the permission from the IAA. So we've got three things there. Even if we felt we could overcome the political and religious hurdles, there's the practical aspect of money and talent.
Little by little, that's all we can do, and hopefully something will happen eventually. Now, staying with some of the architectural features, now the Cenacle in itself, there's an interesting feature called the niche. Explain what that is and what that reveals about the history there.
Right. This is found in the first floor in the Tomb of David area. In fact, the sarcophagus I mentioned sits directly in front of this niche. Now, niche sounds like a really small sort of opening in a wall, but this is actually huge. It's about 9 feet tall and about 6 feet wide. It's a massive concave sort of niche in the wall. And what's very interesting about it is that it is part of the original wall. So the oldest ashlars were used to form this niche. Now, what is it? Okay, that's the most startling feature and really the most identifiable feature of the entire structure, because it's very old. It's the oldest feature, and B, it raises so many questions. Pinkerfeld, who was an Israeli archaeologist, as I mentioned, he went in 1951 to do a very brief archaeological exploration of the site. He uncovered, actually the niche at that time was covered by curtains and plastered over and so forth, but he revealed it. And because other synagogues of the period had Torah niches, he came to the conclusion that the first floor was indeed originally a synagogue. There are some issues with that. Many scholars have pointed out the niche compared to most synagogue Torah niches is huge by comparison. There's nothing like it in any synagogue that we've discovered. It is more like a baptismal edicula or niche that was found at Dura Europos in Syria, a 3rd century house that was converted into a church that has a big niche, very similar in size, and it was used for baptism. Now, we also found at Dura Europos the baptismal font and so forth, which is not present in the Cenacle, in the Tomb of David niche. So it's not a lock or a slam dunk that that's what it was used for. It seems more likely, but again, it's a very odd structure, and it doesn't present itself as being anything particularly obvious. It could have been, as some have suggested, a place for a giant statue. If this was a pagan structure during the time when the Romans occupied Mount Zion, perhaps there was a pagan statue there. We just simply don't know, but it's easily the most intriguing part of the interior of the Tomb of David.
And you said it's part of the oldest wall there, and there's been no test on that wall that would say what that age is?
No, and that's frustrating. What I've always wanted to do, and this may have been prevented, there was some renovation work done in which all of the seams between the ashlars were covered up with plaster or some sort of filler. But before that, these were, they just sit on top of each other. There's no mortar between them. I've always wanted to do core samples, do a boring between a number of the joints of these ashlars, take core samples out and radiocarbon date any organic material that we might find there in the inner core. And perhaps, that would give us some idea of the date when these blocks were put together. It doesn't seem possible now, but I haven't given up on the idea.
And before we talked about how the association with King David happened during around the First Crusade, and do you think part of that, at least a part of that reason, could be because King David and Jesus, they're supposedly related to each other, that Jesus was a descendant of him, and at one point they think that they found a ossuary, a box of bones with James on it, who then people interpreted as James, Jesus' brother. Do you think that that's part of the reason why it got connected as well?
Well, that you brought up two really fascinating issues there. The Crusader, I don't believe that the James ossuary had been discovered
Mm,
at that time,
mm,
but let's talk about that in a second. But the but I do think there's some credibility to what you said about trying to connect, Jesus and James as descendants of David with King David himself. If the Crusaders actually did discover a tomb or a memoriam to David in on Mount Zion, it probably predates the Crusades by how much we don't know. And I would agree with you that that probably is the impetus for having some sort of maybe it's this cenotaph, this sarcophagus that we have today. Maybe it was a series of them in commemoration of, say, James or David or some of these other characters. Stephen, for example, is mentioned a few times, who is not related. But you bring up the James ossuary, and that's another fascinating study in and of itself. I don't know if you're aware, but the James ossuary came to prominence in the collection of an antiquities dealer. It was not discovered in situ. This particular antiquities dealer had possession of it, and it became known in the 80s, I believe. Later, or contemporaneous to that, there was a tomb in Talpiot, Jerusalem, which was made the headlines as the Jesus family tomb. I don't know if you've heard of that, but inside this tomb were some ossuaries that bore the name, for one of the ossuaries, Jesus, son of Joseph. Now, of course, you can imagine the outrage and the consternation over that discovery. But what's interesting is that it appears from the written evidence that one of the ossuaries was missing between the time of its discovery and the time of its cataloging, and there have been some suggestions that the James ossuary came out of that tomb. And just last week, I read an article in which some scientists did soil analyses of the soil residue in the James ossuary and compared it with soil residue from the other ossuaries that came out of Talpiot. And they are convinced that they exhibit the exact same characteristics, and it's highly likely that the James ossuary came from that tomb. That's an aside. It has nothing to do with the Cenacle, but I find that immensely fascinating.
that is fascinating. What do you think? Do you think Do you think that could actually be the bones of Jesus and James, or no?
Well, again, we don't have the bones. Those were
Excuse
taken
me.
immediately once it was discovered what was happening there. It didn't take long, and all the bones were taken and reburied. So we do not have access to the bones, but over that period of time, we have access to residue. There are fragments, very tiny fragments that can still be tested. And I don't know if I've heard that at some point mitochondrial DNA tests were planned. I don't know if those are still on the books or still being planned. But if you could connect some of the people or some of the remains in the different ossuaries, you would certainly at least have a family connection. I'm going to remain agnostic on that question for the moment.
I think we call that politically correct, personally,
There you go.
but that's a politically correct version of that in itself. So
Exactly.
I mean, it's such a fascinating. It's so interesting. I mean, even though we know King David isn't buried there, I mean, it's pretty much fact. But what are the things that we do know? I mean, you talked about how the archaeological and anecdotal evidence both goes back to the 4th century.
That's true.
So to me, it's I hate to say this, but I go with what the evidence tells me until something else is presented. So to me, it seems like most likely it may have been the spot, but that I don't know, and if I had to put something toward it, probably not. What's your opinion? Do you think all this stuff actually happened in that area? I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, that's really two questions there, because here's the first thing. I think that I would lean towards some geographic location on Mount Zion being remembered for something that was associated with either the apostles or Jesus. I mean, that doesn't say much, but I think the memories were probably real. Whether this is the exact site, whether these are the exact things that happened, is very difficult to say. But I don't think the memory came out of whole cloth. I think there's something happened there. And I think that the memory lingered long enough, just as the memory did to locate the area of the crucifixion. I think that something happened on Mount Zion associated and remembered, connected with Jesus and the apostles. Now, this particular building, there's a lot of evidence to support what you've just said, that maybe it's a Byzantine structure and always was. But there's definitely some data out there that can't be dismissed. And one of those, as you saw in the book, is the artistic data. From our very earliest representations, pictorial representations of the Byzantine church, there is a little structure always to its, I guess it would be its south side, that is unexplained. What is that little building? Is that an original church? Regardless of whether Jesus was ever there, is it a very early church from the centuries before Constantine? I think that's not impossible. But to connect all the dots, no, I wouldn't go so far.
And maybe sometimes the mystery is better than the answers. Sometimes, maybe we don't really want these answers. It's good to just keep thinking about the mysteries and believe what you want to believe. Or is that just completely off base? You really want the answer?
No, one thing I've learned in this short career is that there will always be questions. You will never have all the answers. So keep pursuing, keep asking the questions, keep finding the answers, because they'll raise more questions. It's never ending. And so that's part of the fun of it.
And what are you pursuing next? Do you have anything in mind, book-wise, or what's your research leading to next?
Well, I wrote a large paper on the tombs of Peter and Paul and the remains that were found there, remains that apparently go back to 1st or 2nd century human remains. So I've done some work on that. It's been suggested that I turn that into a book. I may do that. I'm also working on a book on the Apostle Paul. I happen to be a subscriber to the kind of growing view of Paul, that he never abandoned his Judaism, that he always remained a faithful Jew, and that he did not form a new religion, but went out there to bring the saving message that he believed came with the Jewish Messiah to the Gentiles, to bring them in to become adopted sons and co-heirs with their Jewish brothers and sisters. So I'm working to, that's the way I teach Paul in our class, and I'm working to put a book together that kind of goes into detail about that.
Sounds like one hell of a guy. I mean, I'd like to get a beer with him for sure. and of course, you'll join us too. I'd like to hope if that ever happens. So.
Oh, definitely.
Well, I really appreciate your time, David. It's truly been enlightening. David Christian Clausen just joined us. We were talking his book, The Upper Room and the Tomb of David, The History, Art, and Archaeology of the Cenacle on Mount Zion. David, thank you so much for your time, and happy holidays.
Thank you, Brian. Same to you.
The Mind's Eye wrap-up when we return. Time for the Mind's Eye wrap-up, my little acorns. You're all nuts. I love you. As always, I really appreciate you listening, and if you really want to give me a holiday gift, I wouldn't stop you from subscribing to Stitcher, YouTube, Twitter, iTunes, Facebook, whatever platform you like. I hope everybody has a great holiday, whatever it is. Let me also wish you a happy and safe New Year, since we won't be back until 2020. And until then, be well and let well be. I'm DJ BJ Turnoff signing off for the Mind's Eye.